Hi everyone. In today's lecture, we are going to cover three large topics. First, we'll talk about the demographic transition. Second, we'll move into the First World War, the 1920s, the Great Depression, and the Second World War. And finally, we will look at the world economic after 1945, including the Bretton Woods, the rise of Keynesian policy, the Great Inflation, and the changes in economic policy after 1970s. These topics may look very different at first. One topic is about population, another is about war, and the last one is about government policy, but they are actually connected. They are all part of a much larger change in the world economy. Over the last 200 years, people became richer, healthier, and more productive. At the same time, governments became much more involved in economic life. So today, we'll try to understand how this change happened. Part one, the demographic transition. So let us start with population. Look at the first graph showing what population over a very long period of time. For thousands of years, world population grew very slowly. Then something changed. Starting around the 19th century, population began to rise much more quickly. And after around 1950, the increase became even more dramatic. So the natural question is, why did population suddenly grow so much? There are basically two possible explanations. One possibility is that people started having more children. In other words, fertility increases. The second possibility is that fewer people died. In other words, life expectancy increased and mortality decreased. Both of these forces matter, but they did not happen at the same time, and that timing is the key to understand the demographic transition. Now we can take a look at the fertility graph. Fertility means the average number of children born per woman. Historically, fertility was very high. In many societies, women had 4, 5, 6, or even more children. Today, fertility is much lower than most rich countries. In countries such as United Kingdom, the United States, China, and many European countries, fertility is now close to even below 2 children per woman. The next graph compares fertility and income. So you can take a look at it. There is a very clear negative relationship in the modern data. Poor countries usually have higher fertility. Richer countries usually have lower fertility. But we should be careful. This relationship did not always work in exactly the same way. At early stages of development, rising income could actually increase fertility. A family with more income could afford more food, more housing, and more children. But later in development, fertility usually begins to fall. This is one of the most important patterns that we want our economic model to explain. Now we can take a look at the graph comparing fertility and children mortality. Children mortality means the share of children who die at the very young age. Countries with high children mortality also tend to have a high fertility. This relationship makes sense. Imagine living in a society where many children do not survive to adulthood. Parents may choose to have more children because they know that some children may not survive. But when children mortality falls, popu- parents can expect more of their children to survive. As a result, they may decide that they do not need to have as many children. The next historical graph shows the children mortality has fallen dramatically. Here, as a result, they may decide that in the 19th century, children mortality was extremely high. In many countries, more than 20% of children died before age 5. Today, in developed countries, this number is very close to zero. This is one of the greatest improvements in human welfare in modern history. The next graph shows life expectancy. Again, the change is dramatic. Okay. For a very long time, life expectancy was around 30 or 40 years. Now, during 19th and especially the 20th century, life expectancy increased very quickly. In many developed countries today, life expectancy is around 80 years. So now we can put the pieces together. Population increases because death rate falls. People began living longer, children became much more likely to survive, but fertility did not immediately fall. For a period of time, death rate was falling while birth rate was still high. That difference creates very rapid population growth, and this is the central idea of the demographic transition. Okay, give me 1 second. I think I heard the fire alert. It's okay. The demographic transition began around 1800. The basic pattern is very simple. First, mortality falls. Then, after some delay, fertility also falls. During the period between these two changes, population grows very quickly. Eventually, countries complete demographic transitions. At that point, both birth rates and death rates are low. These countries usually have more fertility, high life expectancy, and an older population. Look at the same examples in the slides. England and Wales show the classic pattern. The death rate begins to fall first. The birth rate remains high for some time. Later, the birth rate also falls. Sweden shows a similar pattern. We can also see the same general process in countries such as Egypt, here, China, and Argentina. But the timing is different. Some countries started the transition much earlier, other countries started much later. That difference is important because the demographic transition is closely related to economic development. One important consequence is the change in the age structure of the population. When fertility is high, a country has many young people. When fertility falls, people live longer, the population becomes older. The population pyramid in the slide shows that clearly. Over time, the base of the pyramid became narrower. That means that there are fewer children relative to the population. At the same time, the upper part becomes larger because more people survive to old age. That creates new economic challenge. Who support the old population? The dependency ratio gives us one way to think about this question. The dependence ratio counts people who are usually outside the labor force, especially children and older people with working age population. As population age, the old age part of this ratio increases. This can create pressure on pension system, healthcare system, and government budgets. So demographic transition is not simply a story about population growth, it changes the entire structure of the economy. So now we can look at the simple economic model to understand the fertility decisions. We assume that households care about two things. They care about consumption, which we call it C, and also care about children, we call it N. So household utility depends on both consumption and children. The household look likes more consumption and the household likes more children. But both things cost money. We normalize the price of consumption to one. Children also have a cost. That cost may include food, clothing, housing, education, piano lesson, and many other things. The household earns a wage, which we call it W. So the household faces a budget constraint. More spending on children means less money for other consumption. The households must choose the combination that gives that the highest utility. Geographically, we can show that the budget line and the indifference curve. Here, the budget line shows that the household can afford. The indifference curve here shows different combinations of children and consumption that give households the same level of utility. The best choice, this point, is the point where the highest possible indifference curve touches the budget line. This model gives us a useful starting point, but it also creates a problem. In this simple version, when income rises, households can afford more of everything. They can consume more goods and have more children, so fertility keeps increasing with income. But that is not what we see in the real world. At high level of income, fertility falls. So we need a richer model. Now we can adding So now we'll allow parents to invest in their children. Instead of thinking only about the number of children, parents also care about how much they invest in each child. This investment means education, better nutrition, better housing, or simply leaving more resources to the children. We also add another important idea. Children require time. Raising children is not only expensive because parents have to buy things, it also takes time. And the time spending raises children is a time that cannot spend working in the market. This matters more when wages are high. Suppose your wage is very low, giving up 1 hour work to care for children does not cost very much in lost income. But suppose your wage is very high. Now giving up 1 hour of work is expensive. The opportunity cost of time has increased. This gives us a way to explain why rising wage can eventually reduce fertility. At low level of income and assets, a rise in wages may allow families to have more children. But at high levels of income, the time cost of children becomes much more important. Parents may decide to have fewer children and invest more resources in each child. This is sometimes described as a trade-off between the quantity and quality of children. So our richer model is consistent with several facts. In poor countries, increasing wage can initially increase fertility. Richer households may begin reducing fertility earlier, and education, which tends to rise wages, can also contribute to lower fertility. That gives us an economic explanation for the demographic transition. Now we are going to move from population change to one of the most violent periods in the modern economic history. Let us begin with the First World War. The First World War changed much more than international politics. It also changed the relationship between governments and economics. One of the most important economic results of the World War One was a much larger role for government. Before the war, government spending was relatively small in many countries. During the war, this changed very quickly. For example, British government spending increasing from around 10% of GDP to around 70% of its peaks. Even the United States, which entered the war later, increased government spending sharply. Why? Because modern war requires huge amount of economic coordination. Governments need weapons, they need food, they need fuel, they need transportation, and they need these resources immediately. So governments cannot simply wait for markets to adjust slowly. During the war, government began setting production targets, controlling raw materials, and directing resources towards military production. In the United States, the government creates the War Industries Board. In Germany, military planners set production targets and guaranteed profits to industrial firms. So the World War One showed that governments could manage very large part of the economy when necessary. Economic strength also played a major role in the world itself. The Western islands has stronger economics and greater manufacturing capacity. Industrial technology that create the railroad, steel, chemicals, and the machines in the 19th century was now used to produce weapons. This made the war extremely destructive. The financial cost was also enormous. Germany, Britain, and France spent much more $100 billion during the conflict. National debt increased sharply. British sold a large share of its foreign assets to help pay the war. France and Germany relied heavily on borrowing. They expected that if they won, they would they could recover some of the cost from the defeated countries. This explanation became especially important after the war. War also creates inflation. Government spending increases, demand increased. At the same time, resources were being directed away from normal consumer production and towards military production. That combination placed towards pressure on prices. The gold standard was also abandoned during the war. Before the war, currencies were linked to gold, but maintaining the gold standard limit the ability of governments to create money and finance wartime spending. During the war, governments needed much more flexibility, so the gold standard was suspended. The United States were probably the biggest economic winner from the war. Europe needs American goods and American finance. The US economy has been in recession during the beginning of the war and then entered a major boom. Unemployment fell sharply. At the same time, the European economies were badly damaged. Millions of people died. Capital was destroyed, especially in countries such as France and Belgium. Russia experienced revolution and civil war. The United States emerged as the dominant economic power. Another major problem was the threat of the Wesleys. Germany was required to pay reparations. John Maynard Keynes strongly criticized this policy. His argument was that Europe would better off with a strong and stable Germany than the economically destroyed Germany. This issue became extremely important during the next 20 years. Immediately after war, there was a recession. Wartime demand disappeared. Economics has to move worker and factories back towards to civil war production. After the adjustment, the experience of 1920s were very different across countries. The United States had a strong economy. There were easy money, economic growth, and rapid growth in stock market, but a lot of stock market investment were based on borrowing. People were buying stocks partly because they expected prices to keep rising. This is speculation. The problem of a speculative bubble is that higher prices can create even more demand. People see prices rising, so they buy. Their buying pushed prices even higher. So the process cannot continue forever. Eventually, expectations changed. Britain has a much more difficult decade. European governments were trying to reduce the inflation rate during the war. Many followed austerity policies. Britain faced high unemployment. It also faced strong competition from the United States and other producers. The industries that had made Britain the central of the Industrial Revolution were no longer as dominant as before. In 1990, Germany faced even more serious problems. Industrial and cultural production has collapsed during the war. At the same time, the government has large spending needs. It has welfare payments, it has debt, and it had reparations. The government turned to money creation. The result was hyperinflation. Before the war, one US dollar was 4 marks. By 1990, it was 47 marks. By 1921, it was hundreds of marks. And by 1923, prices increasing at unbelievable rates. Workers sometimes needed baskets and wheelbarrows to carry their wages. The value of money could change within a single day. Eventually, the Dawkins Plan helped stabilize Germany. Its debts and payments were reduced, and Germany received foreign loans. A large share of this money came from the United States. For the rest of the 1920s, Germany became heavily dependent on American lending. Remember this point. It became very important when the United States changed monetary policy. France also had major post-war losses. The franc lost value, but the government eventually reduced the deficit and stabilized the currency. France then returned to the golden standard and began accumulating gold. Russia followed a completely different path. The Russian Revolution replaced the old political system. The Bolsheviks nationalized much of the industry, banking, and transportation. But for a period of time, this still allowed some private economic activity. Peasants could sell some of their production, private shops could operate. That helped produce an economic recovery. Later, Stalin moved towards much more aggressive industrialization and collectivization. Agriculture collectivization has terrible human causes. Farm output falls, but industrial production increased rapidly. This creates a very different model of economic development from the market economics of Western Europe and the United States. After the World War I, many governments wanted to return the old economic system. The gold standard was a major part of that system. Why did government want it back? One reason was inflation. The war had shown how quickly prices could rise when governments create large amounts of money. A gold standard placed limits on monetary policy. Another reason was exchange rate stability. Fixed exchange rate could make international trade easier, but the post-war world was very different from the pre-war world. Countries had much more debt, price level were different. Gold was distributed unevenly, and the cooperation between major countries was weaker. The system therefore became fragile. The Federal Reserve also faced a difficult time. Other countries wanted to Fed to keep money easy, but the Fed was worried about the speculation in the US stock market. So the Fed raises interest rate. That reduced liquidity. It also reduced American lending to other countries. Remember Germany. Germany depended heavily on American loans. When American money stayed in the United States, Germany experienced serious pressure. Britain also raises interest rate to defend its gold reserves, even though unemployment rate was already high. So the gold standard linked countries together in a way that could spread economic problems across borders. Britain eventually faced a serious pressure on its gold reserves. In 1921, Britain abandoned the gold standard. Other countries followed. This was important because leaving gold gave governments more freedom. They no longer had to keep interest rates high simply to defend their currencies. They could cut interest rates. They could increase money supply. Their currencies could also depreciate, which could make their export more competitive. As more countries left gold, global monetary policy became easier. This helped the economic recovery. There was also a Keynesian explanation of the depression. The basic idea is that aggregate demand falls too far. Consumers spend less, firms invested less, unemployment rate increased, lower income and causes even less spending. This creates the negative circle. In the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, we can present this as a leftward shift in the aggregate demand. Output falls below its long-run level, prices also falls. The Keynesian solutions is for government to support aggregate demand. Government spending can replace some of the private demand that disappears during a recession. This idea became much more influential after the Depression. World War II began in Europe in 1939. Economic factors again played an important role. Japan was concerned about access to raw materials, especially oil. Southeast Asia has important oil and agricultural resources. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union also partly relative to the desire to control resources, including oil in Caucasus. Just as in the First World War, economic capacity became crucial to military success. At first, the Axis power to controlled a large economic area. But by 1942, the United States and Soviet Union has both enjoyed the Allied side. The Allies then had much larger economic base. Their total GDP exceeds that of the Axis. Their advantage in military production was even larger. The Allies produced far more munitions. After World War II, the United States stood an extremely strong economic positions. It produced a half of the world manufacturing output. It produced most of the world oil and automobiles. The the US economy also continued to grow quickly in the decades after the war. Wartime production methods were transferred to civil industry. Education expanded. Programs such as GL Bill helped veterans receive training and university education. The United States had become an economic superpower. But this time, after World War II, the United States did something different. After World War I, America has moved back towards isolation. After World War II, it chose to make major role in organizing the global economy. One of the first questions was the international monetary system. The old gold standard had failed, but governments still wanted a stable exchange rate. The solution was Bretton Woods system. Under Bretton Woods, most currencies were fixed against the US dollar. So US dollar in turn was linked to gold at $35 per ounce. So the system was not exactly the old gold standard. Instead, the dollar became the center of the system. The post-war period also created major international institutions. The International Monetary Fund, such as IMF, the World Bank, and later the General Agreement on Tariffs on Trade, or GATT. GATT supported lower trade barriers and the most favored nation principles. The goal was to avoid trade wars and economic nationalize that caused so much damage during 1930s. Another major feature of the post-war period was the growth of the welfare state. Politicians were determined to avoid another Great Recession. One major goal was low unemployment rate. Governments were willing to keep Keynesian fiscal policy to support demand. At the same time, governments expanded social benefits. These programs were designed to protect people against unemployment, old age, sickness, and poverty. This is not only a left-wing idea. In many countries, there was broad political support for the basic welfare states. Even conservative governments generally accepted much of the new system. In Europe, this became part of we might call it social market economy. Private business still operated, private properties still existed, but taxes were higher. Government provide more benefits. Labor unions also have a larger role. Some industries were owned by the states. There were also rules protecting workers and tenants. The basic idea was to combine market efficiency with social protection and income redistribution. Now let us return to the international monetary system. Bretton Woods depended on confidence in the dollars. Other countries want to hold dollars as foreign reserves, but this created a basic problem. How could the rest of the world get dollars? One way was for other countries to run trade surplus with the United States, but if other countries run surplus, the United has to run deficits. Over time, repeated US deficits could reduce confidence in the dollar. Foreign governments might start asking to convert their dollars into gold, and that is exactly what happened. By 1960s, foreign governments held more dollars than the United could easily converted into gold. At the same time, the United States were running expansionary fiscal policy. The government was financing the Vietnam War and the major domestic social programs. Inflation increases. Confidence in the dollar weakened. In 1971, President Nixon suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. By 1973, the dollar was floating against other major currencies. Bretton Woods was finished. Was a major change. For the thousands of years, precious metals such as gold and silver had played some role in money. Now, the final form link between the major currency and the gold disappeared. The 1970s created another major challenge. Inflation rose dramatically. In the United States, inflation reached double digits. Britain experienced even high inflation. Japan also experienced very high inflation. Why? There were several causes. In 1973, war in Middle East led oil producing countries to restrict oil exports to several Western countries. Oil prices increased dramatically. Within only a few months, the price of oil multiplied. Oil is an input into almost everything. It affects transportation, it affects manufacturing, it affects heating, it affects electricity, and many other production costs. So when oil becomes much more expensive, firms face higher costs. In the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, we can think of it as a negative supply shock. Short-term aggregate supply shift left, output falls, prices rise. This combination of slow growth and inflation became known as stagflation. This was a major problem for traditional Keynesian policy. If the government stimulates demand, it may reduce unemployment but make inflation worse. If the government reduces demand, it may reduce inflation but increase unemployment. The economic problems of the 1970s will also create a political shift. Before 1970s, there had been broad support for the post-war economic system. Governments tried to maintain low unemployment rates. Welfare states expanded. Taxes were relatively high, but stagflation makes many people question this model. Economists such as Milton Friedman and other economists argue that government intervention has gone too far. They believed rapid attempt to stimulate the economy has contributed to inflation. They also argued that high tax and heavy regulation could reduce economic efficiency. This helped create what science called the conservative renaissance. Government moved towards lower taxes, deregulation, privatization, and stronger focus on controlling inflation. There was also a debate about the labor markets. Europe also continued its efforts to create more integrated economy. In 1979, Europe countries created a European monetary system. Currencies were supposed to remain within narrow bands around fixed exchange rates. The Germany became especially important because Germany had a strong economic and strong anti-inflation central bank. But European economies were still different from one another. This creates problems. After Germany reunification, the German central bank raises interest rate because it was worried about inflation. Other Europe countries then faces pressure to keep their own rates higher in order to maintain their exchange rate. Britain also had a particularly difficult experience. In September 1992, the British government raises interest rate very sharply in an attempt to defend the pound. That policy failed. Britain left the exchange rate mechanism. Other countries also devalued and abandoned their pacts. This experience creates support for even more radical solution. Instead of trying to keep many different exchange rates fixed, Europe could eliminate the exchange rate entirely. It could create one currency. That currency was euro. Exchange rates were permanently fixed in 1999. Euro notes and coins were introduced in 2002, so European integration moved from trade operation to monetary integration. By 1980s and 1990s, the monetary policy has become much more important. Central banks placed greater emphasis on inflation control. Many central banks also became more independent from elected governments. There was still crisis. There were emerging market crises in late 1990s. Stock prices rise dramatically and then fall, but compared with 1970s, inflation was much lower and more stable. So let us finish about connecting three parts of today's lecture. First, we studied the demographic transition. Economic development changed the mortality, fertility, and life expectancy. Death rate falls first. Breeding rates fall later. That creates rapid population growth, followed eventually by aging populations and lower fertility. Second, we look at the period from 1914 to 1945. The two world wars greatly increased the economic role of government. World War I brought huge debt, inflation, and political instability. Attempts to restore the old international economic system were not very successful. The Great Depression then shows how failure in banking, monetary policy, trade policy, and international cooperation could turn a recession into global disaster. World War II again required governments to manage enormous part of the economy. Third, after 1945, governments tried to build a new economic system. Bretton Woods created a new monetary order. The Marshall Plan helped rebuild Europe. Governments accept a larger role in maintaining employment and providing social welfare. For several decades, this system worked relatively well. But the inflation of 1970s created new crisis. That crisis led to tighter monetary policy, great central bank independence, labor market reform, and brought a broader move towards market-oriented policies. So if there is one big idea that creates everything today, it is economic institutions are not fixed. They change in response to economic growth, demographic change, wars, size, and political choices. The world economic of 1900 looked very different from the world economic of 1950. And the world economic of 2000 looked very different again. Understanding these shifts is one of the main goals of economic history. That's it for today. Thank you.